In the early 1800s, one man had a vision so ambitious it might have changed the entire history of North America, to unite every native nation, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, into a single confederacy strong enough to stop the United States at the Ohio River forever. Not one tribe, not an alliance of a few, but all of them, standing as one. He very nearly did it. He was a Shawnee war chief and one of the greatest orators the continent ever produced, and his name was Tecumseh. Only a battle lost while he was away, and a single bullet on a Canadian battlefield, stopped him. This is the story of the man who came closer than anyone to uniting Native America and of the dream that died with him. To understand Tecumseh, you have to understand the world that forged him, a world of endless war. He was born around 1768 in the Ohio country, into the Shawnee Nation, at the exact moment the tribes of the Ohio Valley were being ground between their homelands and the relentless push of American settlers over the Appalachians. War was the constant condition of his childhood. His father was killed by white frontiersmen when Tecumseh was a boy. Older brothers died in the fighting that followed. He grew up watching treaty after treaty signed and broken, watching Shawnee towns burned, watching his people pushed steadily westward. By the time he was a young man, Tecumseh had learned the central lesson of his life and blood, that the nations, fighting one at a time, were being destroyed one at a time. Tecumseh became everything a Shawnee warrior was meant to be, and more. He was famously brave in battle, a skilled hunter, and a natural leader whom men followed instinctively. But two things set him apart. The first was his gift for words. Even his enemies described him as one of the greatest orators they had ever heard, a man who could hold audiences of hundreds spellbound, moving them to tears or to fury with the power of his speech. The second was his character. Tecumseh was known, remarkably, for his humanity in an age of brutal frontier war. He refused to allow the torture of prisoners, protected captives, and condemned the killing of the helpless. Friend and foe alike came to regard him as a man of extraordinary honor. He was the rarest kind of leader, feared as a warrior, and respected as a man. Tecumseh's great idea grew from his childhood lesson, and it was revolutionary. The Americans, he saw, took the land piece by piece, persuading or bribing a single chief, or a small faction, to sign away territory that belonged to everyone, then treating that fraudulent sale as law. Tecumseh's answer was a doctrine of stunning clarity: the land did not belong to any one tribe. It belonged to all native peoples in common, like the air and the water and the sea. And therefore no single tribe, and certainly no single chief, had the right to sell any of it. Any such sale was void. It followed that only a united confederacy of all the nations, acting together, could deal with the land, and that united, they could hold the line the Americans could never be allowed to cross. Tecumseh did not just preach this idea, he set out to build it, and the scale of his effort was astonishing. For years, he traveled thousands of miles across the eastern half of the continent, tireless and relentless, carrying his message from nation to nation. He journeyed to the Great Lakes peoples, to the tribes of the Illinois and Wisconsin country, and then far to the south, to the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Cherokee. Everywhere he went, he spoke, arguing, urging, warning that the nations must set aside their old rivalries and unite, or be destroyed one by one. He was building, by sheer will and eloquence, something that had never existed, a pan-tribal alliance spanning half a continent, held together by a single idea. No one before him had ever attempted anything so vast. At the heart of the movement was Tecumseh's younger brother, a man who had been a failure and a drunkard, and who then transformed into a religious prophet. In 1805, this brother experienced a series of visions and emerged as Tenskwatawa, the prophet, preaching a powerful message of spiritual renewal: reject the white man's goods, his alcohol above all, return to the traditional ways, and the master of life would restore the native world. The prophet's religious revival spread like fire and drew thousands of followers from many nations to a new settlement in Indiana, which the Americans called Prophetstown. Tecumseh provided the political and military vision, his brother provided the spiritual fire. Together, the two brothers built a movement that was both a religion and a confederacy, and that terrified the United States. The prophet's reputation received an almost unbelievable boost from the sky. Skeptical of his powers, Governor Harrison challenged him to prove his connection to the Master of Life by performing a miracle, expecting to expose him as a fraud. But Tenskwatawa, it is said, had learned from British or other sources that a total solar eclipse was coming. He boldly announced that he would darken the sun on a certain day. And on that day in 1806, the moon slid across the sun and turned day to twilight, exactly as he had promised. To the thousands who witnessed it, the prophet had commanded the heavens themselves. His prestige soared, and followers flocked to Prophetstown from across the native world. It was a stunning piece of showmanship, and it shows how the brothers wove together the practical, the political, and the spiritual into a single powerful movement. The man watching all this with alarm was William Henry Harrison, the governor of Indiana Territory, an ambitious official whose main job was to acquire native land for settlement, and who saw Tecumseh's Confederacy as the great obstacle to everything he wanted. In 1809, Harrison pushed through the Treaty of Fort Wayne, buying millions of acres from a handful of compliant chiefs. To Tecumseh, it was exactly the kind of fraudulent sale his entire doctrine forbade. He confronted Harrison directly, and their meetings crackled with tension. In one famous confrontation, Tecumseh warned Harrison that the land sale was illegitimate and would not stand. The two men, the warrior building a confederacy and the governor buying up the continent, understood perfectly that they were on a collision course, and that the future of the Ohio country would be decided between them. One moment from those confrontations became legend. At a tense council in 1810, as Tecumseh spoke, Harrison invited him to sit in a chair, saying that his father, the president, wished it. Tecumseh reportedly refused, gesturing to the ground and declaring that the earth was his mother, and that he would rest on her bosom, sitting down upon the ground instead. In another account of their meetings, tempers flared so badly that weapons were nearly drawn. These were not negotiations between equals in Harrison's eyes, they were a contest of wills between a man determined to buy the continent acre by acre and a man determined to prove that it could not be bought at all. Tecumseh told Harrison plainly that if the Fort Wayne land sale was not undone, he would be forced to seek allies elsewhere, a warning that pointed directly toward the British and toward war. The collision came while Tecumseh was away. In 1811, Tecumseh traveled south on a long recruiting journey to the Creek and other southern nations, leaving strict instructions with his brother: do not fight the Americans until the Confederacy is ready. But Harrison seized the opportunity. He marched an army toward Prophetstown while Tecumseh was gone. And the prophet, against Tecumseh's explicit orders, trusting his own spiritual promises that the warriors would be protected from American bullets, ordered an attack. In the Battle of Tippecanoe, the Confederacy's warriors fought hard but were repulsed, and Harrison's troops burned Prophetstown to the ground. The military defeat was not total, but the spiritual and political damage was catastrophic. The prophet's medicine had failed, his prestige collapsed, and the great Confederacy Tecumseh had spent years building was shaken to its core, all while he was hundreds of miles away. Tecumseh returned to find his life's work in ruins, but he did not give up. Instead, he found a new opportunity in a larger war. In 1812, the United States and Britain went to war, and Tecumseh saw in the conflict the chance he needed. The British and Canada, fighting the same American enemy, were natural allies, and they could supply the arms and support his Confederacy lacked. Tecumseh threw in with the British, and he brought with him the warriors of many nations. He proved to be not just a diplomat and orator but a brilliant field commander. His forces were crucial in the early campaigns along the Detroit frontier, and his leadership helped the British and their native allies win striking victories, including the capture of the American fort at Detroit itself. The capture of Detroit showed Tecumseh's genius, and one story captures it perfectly. To help take the fort, Tecumseh reportedly marched his warriors past a gap in the trees in full view of the American garrison, then circled back and marched them past again and again, making his numbers appear several times larger than they were. The American commander, already terrified of a massacre, surrendered a fort he could have defended. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. And when the fort fell, Tecumseh did what had defined him his whole life: he protected the American prisoners from harm, insisting on the humane treatment that his honor demanded even from a defeated enemy. British officers who served with him left accounts full of admiration, describing him as a man of courage, intelligence, and nobility rarely equaled. But the tide of the war turned, and it carried Tecumseh toward his end. The Americans regained control of Lake Erie in 1813, cutting the British supply lines and forcing the British commander in the West, General Henry Proctor, to retreat from Detroit back into Canada. Tecumseh was bitterly opposed to the retreat. He saw it as abandoning the native cause and the very land they were fighting for, and he denounced Proctor to his face for cowardice. But he would not abandon his British allies, and he would not run. As the American army under his old adversary Harrison pursued the retreating British, Tecumseh prepared to make a stand. He is said to have had a premonition of his own death, telling his warriors that he would not leave the coming battlefield alive. On October 5, 1813, at the Battle of the Thames in Ontario, the end came. The British line broke almost immediately, but Tecumseh and his warriors fought on fiercely in the woods and swamp. And there, somewhere in the fighting, Tecumseh was killed. The exact circumstances of his death were never confirmed. No one is certain who fired the shot, and his body was reportedly carried away and hidden by his own men so the enemy could never find or desecrate it. He simply vanished from the battlefield into legend. He was around 45 years old. With his death, the great confederacy he had built collapsed almost immediately. There was no one else with the vision, the eloquence, and the stature to hold so many nations together. The dream died with the dreamer. The consequences of Tecumseh's death were immense, and they shaped everything that followed. With him gone and his confederacy shattered, organized native resistance east of the Mississippi effectively ended. The barrier he had tried to build at the Ohio River collapsed, and American settlement poured westward unchecked. Within a generation came the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, the very fate Tecumseh had spent his life trying to prevent, and had warned was coming. Even the southern nations he had tried to recruit, like the Creek and Cherokee, were removed within decades. Tecumseh had seen the future with terrible clarity. Divided, the nations would be destroyed one by one. He was proven right in the most tragic way possible, precisely because his vision of unity was not achieved in time. There is a dark footnote that followed the men who beat him. A strange legend grew up around William Henry Harrison, who wrote his fame as the victor of Tippecanoe all the way to the White House in 1840, campaigning on the slogan that celebrated that battle. Elected president, he died just a month after taking office, the first president to die in office. Some later spun this into a tale of Tecumseh's curse, claiming that every president elected in a year ending in 0, at 20-year intervals, would die in office, supposedly cursed by the brother of the man Harrison had wronged. Whether or not you believe in curses, the pattern held with eerie consistency for over a century. It is a piece of American folklore, but it reflects something real, the sense that in destroying Tecumseh and his people, something had been done that would not simply be forgotten. And yet Tecumseh became something larger in death than perhaps even he had imagined in life, a legend honored by his enemies as much as his own people. Americans, even those who had fought against him, came to regard him as a genuine hero, a man of vision, courage, and honor. Towns and counties were named after him. Parents named their sons Tecumseh, including the family of a future Civil War general, William Tecumseh Sherman. The Canadians honored him as a defender of their country. He entered the American imagination as the noble embodiment of the resistance that was crushed. It is a strange kind of immortality celebrated by the nation whose expansion he died fighting, but it reflects a genuine truth, that almost everyone who encountered Tecumseh recognized they were in the presence of a truly great man. So remember Tecumseh, because his life poses one of history's great what-ifs. He came closer than anyone ever had, or ever would, to uniting Native America into a single force capable of standing against the tide, a confederacy from the lakes to the Gulf, built on the simple, powerful truth that the land belonged to all and that divided, the nations would fall. Had the prophet not attacked at Tippecanoe, had the British not retreated, had a single bullet flown differently at the Thames, the map of North America might look profoundly different today. He lost, and the removals he foresaw came to pass. But the clarity of his vision, the vastness of his effort, and the nobility of his character make him one of the towering figures of American history. Next on this channel, the native code talkers whose languages helped win 2 world wars. Subscribe, and keep learning the history they left out.